Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Catholic OCD Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Nolfi. Today, we're going to talk about why are people lazy and why do lazy people cause trouble? And what does the Bible say about lazy people who cause trouble? That's the topic of today's show. Stay tuned. Hope you guys like it. All right, so in our talk on laziness, I want to get us into some basic philosophical history first, which I'm sure you guys are pumped up about. But I kind of want to talk about the Cynics. So when we think of the Cynics or cynicism, it's easy to think of the term now of a cynic is like the two old grumpy men from the Puppets that sat in the balcony and just always got something to say, complain about everything. We think that that's what it means to be cynical. Well, again, let's get back to the actual meaning of what it means to be a cynic. Because in some of these early Greek philosophies, a lot of the names associated with them have really been misused today. They've kind of been characterized in a way that doesn't really represent the school of thought. So, example, like a Stoic, we've already talked about Stoicism before, but today, like when you think of a Stoic, we just think of Bill Belichick, somebody who shows no emotion and just, always got a mean mug on their face. Where Stoicism actually is a very deep school of thought that has to do with strength and virtue. Same thing when it comes to Epicureanism, which we want to talk about. Like today, it's kind of like that just means that like if somebody, is an Epicurean, like it means like, oh, they just are like a heathen and they just indulge in everything. And that's not really fair either. The same thing with a cynic. So a cynic comes from the school of thought. This would be in the mid-300s BC, and it comes from a philosopher named Diogenes. So Diogenes is this guy who kind of, he basically looks like a bum, right? He just walks around. He lays out in the sun all the time. A lot of times you'll see pictures of him like in a barrel, where he sleeps in a barrel, basically, butt naked. And the idea of Diogenes, who again is the founder of cynicism, Diogenes has this idea that, everybody kind of buys into the rat race. Everybody buys into this whole system of like, we got to work hard at these jobs that we hate to buy stuff that we don't need. And we're all just suckers. We're all just working ourselves to death and trying to achieve all this stuff when basically there's freedom in just saying, hey, I want nothing. I need nothing. There's a famous story or legend of Diogenes laying there and it's on a sunny day and he's just, chilling out on the grass, butt naked, pretty much. And all of a sudden, a shadow comes over and a figure like blocks out the sun that he's basically bathing in, and he looks up, and who does he see? He sees Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at that time. And basically Alexander the Great, who would have been a philosophical student himself of Aristotle, Alexander the Great says to Diogenes, wow, I've heard of you. I've heard of your reputation, the wisdom that you have, and I really respect it. I'm the most powerful man in the world. I'd like to give you something to show you how much I respect you. What is it that you would like? And ask me anything, and I'll give you anything that's in my power. And Diogenes kind of looks at him and he's like, yeah, I got something. Can you just move away from the sun. You're blocking my view. I'm trying to get a tan. Now, obviously, the point and the purpose to the legend of the story is this idea that Diogenes had a request at his hand. It was basically like he stumbled upon a magic lamp and he had one wish. And yet, because he was so free, he realized he had no desire. There was nothing that he wanted. This idea of like total detachment from the world and from all desire, from all pleasure, from all duty, this is something that's not just necessarily unique to cynicism. You could actually see this in Buddhism, where, the Buddha, not only renounces all desire and all of the pleasures and all of his possessions that he has, but he renounces his duties. He abandons his wife and his child to go and to just realize that the way to find enlightenment is basically this total detachment. And that detachment is not just from the material realm, but what you end up finding out is when we go down this route, it's a detachment from responsibility. Now, as we talked about before, Zeno, who would be the founder of Stoicism, Zeno, after he loses all of his possessions, stumbles into cynicism. And for somebody who's poor now, somebody who just lost everything, somebody telling you that the secret to life, the secret to happiness is to lose everything, you're kind of thinking to yourself like, wow, well, that's good to know because I just lost everything. So this is how Zeno ends up getting into philosophy. He enters into the school of cynicism. I believe that Zeno grew out of cynicism because what you end up kind of finding out in some of these very enlightened people is that really it's just maybe just laziness, right? I mean, maybe that's actually, it's just kind of a big excuse. So there's the idea of like, well, it's not about winning or losing. It's how you play games. As long as you have fun. And you hear people say like, yeah, that's what losers say. Like it's not about looks, really. Yeah, you hear people say like, yeah, that's what ugly people say. And I think that what happens is there are times when we can neglect our duty. We can neglect our responsibilities. And when we do this, we can enter into this state of laziness. And what ends up happening many times is if we do this, the way that we make ourselves feel better for our failures is usually to actually start to rip on people, to cut down people, to start trouble with people who actually haven't taken that path of laziness and lack of responsibility. When you compare cynicism to Stoicism, Stoicism's going to have this understanding of like, no, you've got a responsibility. You are created by someone. You have to live that life. You have to have a duty to practice the virtue of justice. You have to practice the virtue of justice. You have to participate in making the world and society a more just place. The virtue of temperance, of with everything in moderation, self-control, the virtue of prudence, thinking things out, and the virtue of courage. And courage and strength, this really is a virtue. This gives you the virtue to go do what you have to do. I have a wife. I have 4 kids. If I were to say, listen, I don't want to work anymore. I don't want to provide for you guys. I kind of hate plumbing. I hate doing what I'm doing. And what I've realized is I've been in this rat race the whole time, and it would really be virtuous of me and philosophical of me to really become enlightened and to leave my job, and we could all just, we could just live with love, and that's it. Would that be virtuous of me? Would it be virtuous of me while I have a wife to provide for and children to provide for? Would it be virtuous of me to neglect that responsibility? Laziness is not a virtue. It would not be virtuous for me to neglect that responsibility. It would just be lazy. And we all have a duty in life to be self-sufficient. You are created by God. You're created with certain gifts. You are created in the image and likeness of God. And we have to realize that Adam and Eve were commanded and told to, tend the garden before the fall of man. This means that just working in the garden was not a product or a result of the fall of man. Working for the human is given to humanity before the fall, which means work is good. Working and being productive is good. Now, obviously, let's tie this into the virtue of temperance. We could also see that, we could take it too far. You could become obsessed with money. You could set money as your God. You could set work as your God. And obviously, that is not the answer. But at the same time, just neglecting the idea of work is not a virtuous thing. And for some reason, we kind of think that it is. We kind of think that, yes, I'm going to be a wise person. I'm going to be a philosopher. I'm just going to put on my white toga and I'm not going to have any job. I'm just going to go and sit by a tree, sit in a barrel, and talk. And is it a coincidence that the cynics, when you hear of the word cynic, it's not just registers like laziness to people, but it registers like complaining about people, basically mocking other people. Look at that guy over there. You believe that sucker got a job? Oh my gosh, what a fool. What a sucker. He's just part of the rat race, man. And what ends up happening is you have time to rip on other people. I've even seen it a lot with, even when it comes to Christianity, you can see certain people in my years of a Christian in different Christian churches. Like, I met a lot of people who they were going to go into a full-time ministry. Sometimes they were they were very devout and they just really wanted to spread the word. A lot of times I feel like they were lazy. They didn't want a job. I would see this often, like people would go right from, they'd be part of the youth group to then they were helpers in the youth group. They were on the youth group team and then they went to become a youth pastor. And a lot of it was I noticed that you don't read. I noticed that you don't really study the word. And I also noticed that you don't know how to use a shovel. Is the reason you went into ministry because you just really felt the call, or was it because you were lazy? I'll be honest with you. I sometimes watch a lot of these podcasts and stuff like that. And when I watch a religious podcast, I admit that there are times when people are like, listen, be sure to be sure to contribute to this podcast. This is my only source of income. So be sure to, if you can, to contribute to it. And there is part of me, it's like, well, yeah, I know how you could solve that problem really quick. Go get a job. Go get a job. Somebody told me one time years ago, a Catholic radio host, and he always said, he says, listen, I don't charge any money for what I do. He's like, my best advice I could ever give you, if you want to have a ministry, provide for your family with a job. Go get a job. That's how you provide for your family. and then the ministry thing should be free. There's a freedom in it. There really is, because you get to say whatever you want because nobody can fire you because you don't make any money from it. But looking at the Bible, we see that Jesus picks really workers, right? He picks fishermen. He picks these people that know how to work. And even when we get to St. Paul, we'll see that St. Paul, as he traveled and he did all this missionary work, he was a tent maker. He provided for himself. St. Paul discovers a problem in Thessalonica. And part of what's happening in Thessalonica that he's going to write about is, you have to understand that the early church lived in like communities. Okay, they really did. They lived in these forms of like it was a somewhat of a communism, right? Or some sort of like the socialistic idea. They shared everything. They contributed or distributed to everybody according to their means or to their needs. And this is really how they lived. Maybe community gardens but I think that we can see that there's still humanity involved with the human being, and it really didn't work out that good. Because what you'll realize is that there are lazy people who aren't going to work. And what was happening in Thessalonica is there were people who they weren't going to go out into the field. Like, they weren't going to work in the garden. They weren't going to chop wood. They weren't going to do any of this stuff. They were lazy. And not only was their laziness negative in the sense that they didn't produce anything, their laziness was negative in the sense that it gave them opportunity to gossip. They had time to know about everybody's business. They had time to be able to be cynical about other people, to complain about other people. And you might realize in your own experience that some of the people that gossip the most sometimes can be lazy people. They're the ones who have free time. It's kind of like when you've got a lot of things going on. I got to do this, I got to go to work, I got to do this, got to study, got this, I'm so busy, this kid's in sports, I got to do this and that. And somebody just wants to keep on bringing up to you like, oh, did you hear so-and-so talk to so-and-so on the phone and what they said? And it's kind of like Jim Carrey from Dumb and Dumber when he's like, no, and I don't care. Like, you don't have time to be vested in every little detail about everybody's life. This is what was happening in Thessalonica, and this is what St. Paul has to straighten out. So this is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6. We instruct you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to shun any brother who conducts himself in a disorderly way and not according to the tradition they received from us. Oh, wait, there's that tradition word. Everybody hates that word. So Paul here is basically encouraging people to hold on to the tradition that they have received from St. Paul. Okay, for you know how one must imitate us. For we did not act in a disorderly way among you, nor did we eat food received free from anyone. On the contrary, in toil and drudgery, night and day we worked, so as not to burden any of you. Not that we do not have the right, rather we wanted to present ourselves as a model for you, so that you might imitate us. In fact, when we were with you, we instructed you that if anyone was unwilling to work, neither should that one eat. Now, what Paul is saying here, it's to some people, they're like, well, that doesn't sound very biblical. Well, it's from the Bible. What Paul is saying is like, listen, we came to do ministry. When we came, we didn't just try to mooch off you. We worked for our own stuff. Why? He's like, we could have asked you for food. The worker is worth his wages. That's what the Bible says. Don't ever let anybody try to twist you when it comes to tithing with this idea of the worker's worth his wages. I'm going to tell you a secret about the mega pastors, these people who want to get rich off of Christianity. Here's the secret, and it ties together with guilt. It ties together with guilt. What they do, many of them, is that basically they will show you how you can be blessed by giving to God. Like how the more you give to God, the more he will bless you. The more you do for God, the more he will do for you. You want more health, you want more wealth, you want a bigger house, then you need to give to God. And they'll show you this is biblical. The Bible talks about how we need to give to God. And you're like, yeah, I do see that. Here's where the trick is, though. How do you give to God? Does anybody have his address? Like, how do you give to God? And what they'll convince you is that if you give to them, you're giving to God. When you give money to them, you're giving money to God. Now, listen, there are ministries out there. I know people. I'll give you an example. I know AJ, who has the studio. He would give the shirt off of his back. I see how he uses the money that he gets. I see how he purchases Bibles for people. I see what he does to try to spread the gospel. I see people in ministry, priests and different other Protestant pastors and Orthodox priests who really use this as a sword. They have a job to do. They have to teach the faith. They're allowing people to provide for them to have a basic living, but they're not sucking all of this stuff and, living in this $1 million house or doing this or doing that. Paul's showing that it's okay to take care of people who are in ministry. It's okay to provide for them. But Paul's saying he's saying, I didn't do that. We didn't take advantage of that. We just said, we're going to provide for ourselves. And the reason he's saying he did it is for an example. And he's hearing about these people who don't want to work. And he's saying, I'm telling you, whoever doesn't work, they don't eat. It is a Christian morally responsibility. It's a Christian moral responsibility to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. It is not a Christian moral thing or responsibility to provide and to feed and to give to those who will not work, who just don't want to work, who just choose to be lazy. We have to take care of those who can't, not take care of those who won't. So and you could be saying, that doesn't sound very Christian. That doesn't sound very biblical. What Paul's saying is right here, if you're not going to work because you just don't want to work and you just want to gossip and you're lazy, you're not eating. And if you do that, trust me, they get hungry enough, they're going to pick up that shovel. Now, he continues then, we hear that some are conducting themselves among you in a disorderly way, by not keeping busy, but minding the business of others. Such people we instruct and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to work quietly and to eat their own food. But you, brothers, do not be remiss in doing good. If anyone does not obey our words as expressed in this letter, take note of this person, not to associate with him, that he may be put to shame. Do not regard him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. Now, I want to say this in a side note. My grandpa, Nolfi, old Italian guy, he was a very, very hard worker. He was just one of the hardest workers I ever met. And he was a quiet guy. I don't know how the heck I'm even related to him. But he was a very quiet guy, and he just worked. And he worked until he was 80. He was trying to work till the day he, died. And on his tombstone, it actually has this verse about, just working with your hands and living a quiet life. And what Paul's here saying is that's the duty, to work, to do good, to talk good about people. Don't be a lazy gossip who then just is yeah, you see what's his name working in a garden? oh man, he's not enlightened like me. But I'm going to eat his food though anyway, so I'll ask him for money. And that's not the key of the Bible. And this is why Paul says, like, in these communities, he's like, no, listen, you kind of got to, cast them out, put them to shame. He's like, not so that you can just, for the sake of like viewing them as an enemy, but this is kind of a discipline that makes them or encourages them to come back into work. So I think that what we're seeing today, obviously out in the workforce, you can't get people to go to work anymore, and a lot of it is the government stepping in. They'll provide for you. You don't even have to pray about money. We'll be your God. We will provide for you. We will take care of you. And they're basically making it look like everybody else who has stuff and who had his job, it's all because of their privilege. And it's really, all this is a regurgitation of a school of philosophy from 300 years ago of cynicism. And really, even 100 years before that, of certain parts of schools of thought of Buddhism, which is this idea of really detaching yourself from the material world and from even your responsibilities. And when you look at some of those, some of even like the monks and your Buddhist monks and things like that, like there were people that they would convince you, like when you gave to them, you're getting karma. Like this is the one way you can get karma, by giving to them. And you'll still see this today. There are like Jesus talks about the sheep's, the wolves in sheep's clothing. There are people in the ministries, people who proclaim Christianity, people that you see, when you wake up late or early in the morning or whatever, and you turn on the TV and you see this mega pastor, like basically they would take your home from you if you would give it to them. And then they would fly on their own private jet someplace, and they're not going to dig. And I guarantee you, like the way because I've been involved with like churches when something goes wrong, or there's problems, or there's water that leaks. Like I've seen pastors that will go, they'll try to work, and they're like, I've gone and repaired plumbing stuff at certain churches, and people will come, they'll give you a hand. There's other ones, man, they wouldn't pick up a broom. They just would not pick up a broom. And it's not manly. It's lazy. And it's like Clint Eastwood, what was that? Pill Rider, I think was the movie, right? When he's the preacher man. And remember, they go to work and they're like, preacher man, you're supposed to be the preacher. You ain't supposed to work. And remember, he says, the spirit ain't worth spit without a little bit of sweat. That's a good ending though, right? Clint Eastwood, you can't do better than that. So listen, this was a little thought on laziness. What does the Bible actually say about laziness? Jesus walked a lot. He carried his cross. He was a carpenter. He wasn't lazy. St. Paul did not encourage laziness. Diogenes did. His philosophy sucked. The Stoics realized that they were wrong. So don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast. If you don't, it means you're a lazy piece of crap, okay? I'm your host, Nick Nolfi. Thanks for watching. Go Chiefs.